Welcome to all of you viewing. I am your host Lenore, and I am the Revolutionary Goth. As promised, I am featuring a review of a classic work. I would argue that this is the first truly Gothic album. Now, there are many albums that predate this that contain many Gothic elements. However, I think the combination and culmination of all of these things first happened here. And thus I am reviewing, analyzing, and dissecting Thecure's Pornography. Now, due to YouTube censorship being notoriously strict, I will most likely have to avoid mentioning the name of the album if I don't censor it entirely. And so when I say that this album is the first truly Gothic album, I mean that wholly. I don't mean it is the first to feature Gothic themes, or that it is the first to inspire Gothic music. I simply mean that it is the culmination of everything that came before it, and set the standard for what all goth music would be. And if you saw my previous video and review of Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, you would know that I mentioned the sublime a lot. This is because the sublime has complex origins that are directly intertwined to goth. I will provide a brief, simple explanation. In short, the sublime is the violent, scary, raw, visceral aspects of nature personified. It is what gives rise to things like horror. It is the most real aspects of our existence and lives. It is the immense fear you get at sea when you are caught in an intense storm. It is sensations and feelings that we are often very removed from in our modern world. This removal and dissonance from that which is truly the sublime is what allows us to enjoy the sublime through art. That is what is known as delight, the enjoyment we get from mere indulgence in this media. I'm sorry to those of you who still don't quite understand. Again, I will be unpacking it in full in the future if all of you wish. But why did I bring up the sublime? Well, you are right, but to analyze it properly, we must understand that the sublime is an integral part of goth, and I'd argue that this album features it in a very interesting, subtle, and intricate way. But anyways, with our definitions and all that has been established out of the way, let's get into actually analyzing and dissecting this classic work. Starting with the opening track of this project, we have 100 Years. This continues throughout, beginning into the first verse as well, with brooding, depressed melancholy exhibited via the vocals. Themes of suicide are even mentioned within the first few lines. It continues on with a great degree of repetition. All of these ideas build a sense of dread, and if anything, they are already giving in to this sort of sublime, confronting the harshness of reality and society. This is the sublime personified. We experience indulgence. We experience delight. And this track, so early on, the very first track in this project, discusses disillusionment with society and capitalism. This is another reason that I believe this to be the first truly and wholly Gothic project. It contains the macabre, the taboo, disillusionment, dissatisfaction, and a desire to rebel against the capitalist system. And it contains the sublime, with lines like hope for something better being taken as not serious and a mere joke. It signifies that those who hope for and call for a better and brighter future beyond this post-industrial hellscape are met with ridicule, and this is a core theme of a great amount of Gothic music and literature. Goths by nature often tend to embrace and relish in the fact that not much ever seems to change. The world is bleak and dark and grueling. Goths simply choose to accept that, and in a great irony of sorts, end up being a major force of light within this world, those who actually do seek to uphold change and enact it. However, this is expressed through art and creative means via these seemingly grueling, apathetic, and depressed means. We can also immediately draw real-life parallels with how this sort of global, imperial-dominated capitalist system is seen as the best we have. It has often been said that we are at the end stages of history. To hope for something better is seen as comical. A prayer for something better is simply a prayer. At the end of the second verse, the line, waiting for a death blow, is repeated ad nauseum. This seems to suggest that the speaker is dying or waiting for death, either via self-inflicted means, or it could signify a sort of mental or spiritual death due to disillusionment and alienation, because all we are reduced to is tools for capitalists. Much space is continuously given to the eerie and dissonant instrumentation. This is all before the vocals and even more thought-provoking lines and imagery cut through. This next verse uses irony to invoke this sort of embarrassing feeling. It engages with the manufacturing of consent for those who are deemed as freedom fighters to fight on behalf of the imperial core, when in reality, all that these supposed freedom fighters do or accomplish is massacre and bathe in the blood of their victims within their countries. All of this is being done, funneled, funded, and supported by the imperial core, while things are just as bleak and dreary as ever back at home. We are no richer, no better off, no closer to one another via these wars and endless bloodshed. One of the lines in this verse, which says, "Have we got everything?" also poke at this idea and imagery. Additionally, one of the most disheartening aspects of this song is the death of a small girl's father. This again pokes at and invokes this sort of shame that many of us should have regarding imperial wars and conflicts. Now, I cannot find any indication of whether or not that this father dying was one resisting, imperial wars, or if he was one fighting on behalf of the imperial core. However, either way, this paints just as bleak and depressing of an image and demonstrates the monstrosity that is this global imperialist nightmare, and the pain it inflicts upon others and loved ones. Verse 4 delves into the incredibly uncomfortable and touchy subject, which is sex work. The sex worker is described as fixing her makeup essentially after the deed and prettying herself up. This highlights the material reality that she is just a piece of meat, her body a tool. Her body is commodified and utilized as labor. It is and should not be seen as a critique of her or her work, rather of the system we reside under, her dehumanization, her objectification, and her commodification. This represents, again, broader anti-capitalist critiques. We then get references to a sort of deliverance under a black flag, This again highlights and illustrates the problem with endless war, bloodshed, and imperial conflict, and it invokes the bleak imagery and disaster that these things bring. 100 Years, the name of the track, is utilized as brutal imagery. It expresses and indicates that our reality, the very fabric of such, is seemingly endless in this form. This ultimately culminates in the speaker ending his own life with the sound of his neck snapping from a noose. All in all, this is one of the most intense track openings of any album. When properly analyzed and dissected, you really begin to see all of the important Gothic elements and themes. It is visceral, it is hard to digest, as Gothic media should be, and doesn't contain the Orientalism of Juju. I do apologize for that snark remark. I love Susie, but she was very much Orientalizing when it came to a lot of her work, but I'm sure many of you know that. Next up on our track list is A Short-Term Effect. Now, this track is much more disjointed and often invokes a sort of psychedelic feeling and imagery. It does so quite brilliantly with fading, distorted guitars. The instrumentation aids this theme perfectly. It delves in to complex issues and dark ones, such as substance abuse and death. It utilizes its bleak imagery and psychedelic effect to, again, critique capitalism. It suggests that the very reason people feel the need to engage in substances that are objectively harmful is to escape the bleak reality we live in. At a certain point of disillusionment and discontentment, it is hard to want to remain within such a reality. Again, this project continues to demonstrate its ability to captivate the listener, to make them uncomfortable, but to present them with very thought-provoking ideas. It is a critique of the society we live under. The Hanging Garden is an incredibly interesting track in terms of analysis. This is primarily because I, admittedly, don't know how to analyze it. I don't know the meaning of the track, and I'm sure most don't. The entire track feels like a fever dream, in the best way possible though. In fact, it's one of my favorites. However, I think its positioning within the track listing does serve a purpose. Its dissonance, its atonality, its fever dream-like qualities all point to that it may be what one experiences during substances. It is chaotic, it is messy, but it is beautiful in a sense. It's seemingly impenetrable, and yet, on the one hand, one of the most understandable and easy to grip tracks. It is walking contradiction, and it is very interesting at that. So no, while I cannot analyze individual lines or themes, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it actually aids to the overall album and experience. Siamese Twins is arguably the most interesting and disturbing track on this project. It seemingly starts much lighter with chimes and interesting elements compared to the previous tracks. However, it is the drums and vocals that cut through and allow for the horror to truly emanate from this track, which are seemingly a personal reflection. It discusses and deals with cannibalistic-like bonds between two persons when their bodies become one in flesh with one another. Now, this track, I have realized I most likely have analyzed incorrectly, and I want to say that before going further with my analysis. However, the point of art is interpretation and analysis. It is through my experience, my feelings, that I have interpreted this track in this way, which makes it much more visceral and real. In fact, I'd argue this track is enhanced by the interpretation I am lending it. So I will get this out of the way, that most people's analysis of this track may be more related to the speaker's relationship to a sex worker. However, I have a very different idea, and I will explain why. It seems to me that this track delves into the idea of losing one's virginity in a very harmful or traumatic way that leaves the speaker traumatized and filled with horror, and within an incredibly complex relationship with the person they lost it to. The opening chimes and instrumentation, and even some of the vocals, seem to indicate that this started out as seemingly beautiful, something incredibly pure, and in the eyes of the speaker, something that would flourish and blossom into a long-term relationship. However, it is this act that fueled self-hatred and anguish, and despite as such, there seems to be a longing for the conjoinment of these two, alluded to by the title of the track. The very experience that was at first deemed as beautiful left the speaker in ruin, tragedy, and disgust. Lines like, "Is it always like this?" present this in such a real and horrific way, and this parallels real sexual abuse and the feelings one is left having in such a beautiful but disturbing way. It leaves one torn, broken, conflicted, and disgusted each and every time, even when those new experiences are truly and wholly beautiful. It removes one's normalcy and their relationship to sex. Again, I see this interpretation as far more likely, unless I am just personally biased, as this track deeply resonates with me and makes me very emotional. It continues on with the speaker reveling in and acknowledging the horror and disgust with that very experience, and yet longing for it, still desiring to be one of two Siamese twins. Brutal and grotesque imagery continues, with lines such as, "Worms eat my skin." We are put in a position of immense sympathy with the speaker and the long-term damaging effects this experience had. Final lines end with the speaker condemning her and the experience via hatred. This is often after a point of acceptance for those who have experienced traumatic experiences. It takes acceptance that this truly was horrific, and enough time to be able to actually hate the one who did this to you. Now again, this doesn't apply to all situations of abuse, and feelings look very different for very many people. However, this sort of final condemnation and realization that the speaker hates the one that did that to him resonates much more with me and seems to make sense. Again, he asks, "Is it always like this?" The figurehead continues on with these themes, dealing with what is the aftermath of Siamese twins. Again, the instrumentation and vocals aid this horrific imagery, as always. It results in condemnation and complex feelings and grappling with his relationship to her, his hatred of her, with lines such as, "I can never say no to you," indicating her role in complacency with his abuse. Again, this simply demonstrates a complex and disturbing relationship with one who has been abused and their abuser. And despite this relationship, he is the one who feels unclean and dirty, which again parallels real-life examples of abuse. The tone again shifts with the track A Strange Day. At this point within the album, the speaker is well aware of the horrors of reality, the abuse, the disillusionment, the alienation, the death, and the disease. And thus it takes a Gothic approach to this. It accepts this bleak reality. It becomes content with it, if you will. Now, I keep phrasing this in this way, and I don't mean that Goths are okay with the world we live in. Instead, it is the most pure and raw understanding of what this world is. The world most turn a blind eye to. One in which we know most don't even hope to change it. And thus, this track is much slower with wondrous instrumentation, and it is quite beautiful. It sees A Strange Day as potentially the last day on Earth. It is again aiding in this anti-capitalist critique, depicting disillusionment in the very truth that we may cannibalize ourselves. We live in such a dark timeline where destruction of ourselves is a reality we may have to grapple with. The speaker has essentially given up, which obviously is not what any of us should do, and I don't think that's the point of the track. As a piece of art, this is not written to say we should give up. Instead, the speaker is who we should not be. We should not simply wait for the end of the world to pass us by. We should not wait idly by while the world crumbles around us. However, that's what the speaker does, and he does so peacefully and with contentment. Now to the second to last track, and my personal favorite, Cold. It begins with some of the most gripping and interesting instrumentation of the entire album. It immediately shows that it is a well thought out track through and through, beginning to end. It has similar aims and feelings as the last track, however it delves much more into substance abuse and drug use, with arguably some of the best pacing and again instrumentation of the entire project. The vocals are brooding, depressive, and convey everything they need to convey with a great depth and display of emotion, just as they should. It is as open-ended as the previous tracks, but in the best way possible. The track truly does invoke this sense of cold. It is bleak, it is grim, but it is beautiful. It is the delight we experience when gazing upon harsh winters and wintry storms, frostbite forming at someone's hands or feet. It is cold. It is visceral, raw, and real as any of the other tracks, if not more so. Yet it is so ambiguous and vague that it allows us to formulate our own interpretations. I feel as if every time I listen to this track, I feel or notice something different, and that is because of its open nature. We are allowed to insert ourselves into the sublime and this cold feeling. Thus, every time we draw out something new from it. And thus, that is why I think it is the most beautiful track of all. It truly personifies what goth is. Beautiful, haunting instrumentation, horror elements, and most of all, the sublime and the delight we experience from it. And last but certainly not least, the title track. Now, this is another track that feels like a fever dream. In fact, I think it is the most chaotic, messy, and hard to interpret of any of them. However, it does so with much more powerful and concluding instrumentation. It leaves the listener in confusion, despair, and discomfort with all of the feelings the album is trying to convey. This album at many times is loosely strung together and is seemingly chaotic. And yet, the more you analyze it, the more you grapple with its feelings and themes. It seems so perfectly calculated. Everything works together as one beautiful portrait or piece, all of which truly encapsulate goth. It truly illustrates and embodies what goth is, a natural evolution to punk. It is far past mere outcries. It is an insatiable desire and urge to change the systems we live in, to accept them so that we may change them, to understand the sublime, to understand the visceral reality that is our nature. Goth is not simply music. It is not simply politics. It is not the mere combination of those two. It is a philosophy, a way of thinking, a way of life, a way of understanding the sublime and the reality we reside in. It is a natural and normal response to the discontented and disassociated members of society who understand truly the bleak reality we live under. With this analysis complete, I do truly believe that this is the pinnacle, the culmination, and the first truly Gothic album. In fact, it is one of my favorite albums of all time, across genres. I truly think it is remarkable and nearly perfect, with the only blemish being the title track. I think it is far weaker than the others, but still serves and aids the entire artistic piece. But with that out of the way, I hope you all enjoyed this review and analysis. Let me know your thoughts. Maybe let me know your ranking of the tracks down below, least favorite to favorite. If you do want to check out my other channels, they will be linked down below via my link tree, or you can check out my socials there. I bid thee a farewell, and I will see all of you on the next episode of The Revolutionary Goth.